Yesterday afternoon around 1:30 or so, I came back over here from the parish hall where I had greeted members of Emily Cox's family who were gathering apart before the beginning of her burial Eucharist. And I came into the choir room where our music director and organist were doing some last preparations. I walked into the sacristy where our acolyte and Eucharistic ministers and some folks from the altar guild were sitting together. And everything was pretty much ready to go. The checklist had been gone over for the second or third time. We were just waiting. And in that moment, it struck me, looking around at my friends, these people are also grieving. Grieving and preparing to welcome about 300 people between this space and the overflow seating in the parish hall, another 45 or so who watched the service live on our YouTube channel, where the recording of the service has now been seen by 350 other people. And that's what we saints do. We grieve, and yet together we also are drawn by the love of Christ to welcome others into the feasting of his resurrection. Grieving, and yet joyful, full of hope. A hope that itself, as we hear in the wisdom of Solomon this morning, is full of immortality. So they came in the hundreds, other mourners, drawn here out of their love for Emily, but perhaps also seeking a taste of that hope, a hope of something beyond their grief, something deeper than their loss, a hope for a word of life in the midst of death. And that is what Jesus brings in the gospel lesson today, coming to the village of Bethany, where his friend Lazarus has died. He arrives too late to save Lazarus from dying. This little family of Lazarus and his sister Mary and his sister Martha. The gospel says that Jesus loved with a particular love. He's not forgotten them, because God has not forgotten them. He meets them as they come out to meet him. And he meets them in their grief. Jesus also weeps. And this story does not gloss over the reality of death. After all, when Jesus asks Martha to roll the stone away from the tomb, she says, "But Lord, he's been dead for 4 days. He will be beginning to stink." And yet the word of life that Jesus has been sent by God into the world to speak, the same word through which God spoke the world into existence at the beginning, the same word by which God will pronounce the completion of all things at the end. That word goes into the darkness, the tomb, into the realm of death, into the power of grief, and says, "Lazarus, come out." Yesterday was also the service of the institution of our new presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. And the now most Reverend Sean Rowe preached on these same texts. One thing that he said that I especially appreciated in his sermon on this gospel lesson was how, having summoned Lazarus out of the tomb, Jesus then turns things over to the other mourners who are gathered there. Lazarus standing at the mouth of his grave, still bound hand and foot, still with his face shrouded in the cloths in which he has been buried. And Jesus says to all those who are gathered there, "You unbind him and let him go." Snap out of your grief, even as it still weighs heavy on you. And you complete this work that I have spoken into reality. And so that's what we did yesterday. We welcomed those mourners, and we invited them to unbind Emily, to unbind her from her tomb, and to let her go. Let her go into that greater life, which is God. We invited them to touch her body in the body of Christ, into which she was baptized, along with all of God's saints. And they came, and they knelt here. They received the bread and the wine, which are the broken body of Christ who died on the cross, which are the spilled blood of his compassion. And those who did not wish to receive the bread and wine, they crossed their arms over their chests and invited me to touch them on the forehead and pronounce words of blessing over them. This is what saints do. They allow themselves to be that body that broken body, that shed blood, and to be touched as they touch others. We sometimes imagine that their lives were not like ours, that they went around with their feet 18 inches off the ground, sort of drifting in a rosy cloud of holiness, dispensing miracles like candy, rather than being people like us, people who grieved, people who struggled against injustice, people whose hearts were broken by the afflictions of others, people bent down under the weight of the power of death that holds so much sway in this world. And yet who nonetheless were able to speak, to act, to love out of hope. A hope that is full of immortality. After things wrapped up here, we moved the party over to the Ashland Armory, where there was a continuation in the form of a more secular kind of celebration of life. But we were there too, as hosts, with drink and food that we prepared along with Emily's family. John Ferris was the master of ceremonies, going around with the microphone, encouraging people to share their thoughts and memories about Emily, holding fast to the microphone, maintaining control, but also a warm and inviting and compassionate presence. And one of the more striking moments in that celebration was when Emily's ex-husband, James, who many of you know, got up and read portions of a letter that the family had received from the organization that was responsible for seeing that those parts of Emily's body that could still be used by someone else were distributed. And he read brief synopses of the stories of the man who got her lungs, now can breathe again. The man who got one of her kidneys, so no longer has to undergo weekly dialysis treatment. And another woman, a young woman, who got the other kidney. There's a powerful testimony to the communion of saints when he spoke of how the gift of her body, broken and shared with the world, would touch not only those recipients of her donations, but everyone with whom they would come into contact. All the people who loved them, depended on them, all those whose lives they would touch. That is the communion of saints. A body, the body of Christ, broken and shared with the world. And yet also done so with hope. A hope full of immortality. A hope that that body which has been broken, for a world that is broken, in grief, for a grieving world, will also be gathered together by God, gathered back together into one. When God comes to dwell on this earth, face to face, no longer separate from us, embracing all of life, clothing it with immortality, raising that broken body in a new heaven and a new earth, dwell and abide forever in love.